a more positive future. There's a lot of people think, well, if that's happened, then Russia's going to immediately like take the or in short order take the rest of Ukraine and then start invading the Baltics and taking a bunch of. And they will not succeed in that because of the immense opposition of the local people. If they could take more of Ukraine, they would, and they can't. So I think we should stop sacrificing the flower of Ukrainian youth in trenches pointlessly, and do a ceasefire and begin the process of renormalizing relations with Russia. And it should be said that Russia and Ukraine, I mean, they're quite literally cousins. Like the people have family in both. It's that the people in Ukraine have family in Russia. People in Russia have family in Ukraine. So they were sort of really part of one country for many, many years. The best rocket technology was when Ukraine and Russia were working together, and when they were not working together, their space technology suffered immensely. So like what I'm trying to say is that these are not natural adversaries. It doesn't make sense. That they have their grievances, but they are quite literally family. And I think we in the West are sort of pushing them to kill their sons, and it seems wrong to me to do that. So, and then to add to the regional tragedy, there is the civilizational risk that we are brewing by making Russia a pariah to the West, not allowing international transactions with Russia, basically extreme sanctions. And I should say this weaponization of the dollar, I think we've overplayed our hand in weaponizing the dollar with sanctions. So because you're now seeing a lot of countries de-dollar their transactions. Because we've sort of forced it, and this goes beyond even Russia, China, and Iran, because countries like, say, Brazil or India still want to transact with Russia. They can't do it with dollars, so we force them to de-dollarize their transactions, thus weakening the strength of the dollar in the world. So, like these actions are strategically foolish, it seems to me. But like I said, we should just sort of stand back and say, what is the most important thing? The most important thing is avoiding World War III, because we may never recover from World War III. And I think we're currently have the risk of World War III is increasing rapidly. And I think if relations are renormalized with Russia, the probability of World War III is dramatically lower. So,
yeah, I actually think that it's far more achievable than we've made it out to be. And David, Zach, I got a lot more to say, but maybe you want to take a couple questions from the audience too. I saw someone from the IDF is asking a question too.
Okay, great. Yeah, maybe. I don't see. Let's see. Let me try and make you a co-host, and then you can call on people as well. While we're doing that, Alexander, why don't we get your take on whether it's still possible to work out a deal with?
I think it is possible to come to a deal with Russia on Ukraine. It will not be easy at all, and the window for that deal is perhaps not going to be open indefinitely, because obviously there is a war, and that war is fluid. It has its own dynamic, and I personally think that the longer we leave it for a deal to be done with Russia on Ukraine, the more unsatisfactory to us that is going to be. Now, if I can just make a few observations generally about US-Russian relations. Firstly, I think we have to understand that there is going to be a continuum between the situation we have today, which is essentially that we have no contacts with the Russians. We don't trade with them. We don't speak to them. When we do speak to them, we just lecture them. And the situation of having a complete rapprochement in which we are back to a full normal relationship, such as we used to have after the end of the Cold War. Now, you can perhaps aim at the second, but you can start with perhaps less ambitious objectives. You can start talking. You can start meeting Russian officials and communicating with them and putting aside some of this extremely dangerous rhetoric that we have. Because just to give an example of what diplomacy is about, it's not just about, working together to find long-term outcomes. Eventually we might come to that. But if we're talking about the present situation in the Middle East, one of the things that is making it so dangerous, one of the things that's making the Ukraine crisis so dangerous, is that because we are not talking to them and they are not talking to us, and we're not talking many cases to many of the various important players, everybody is guessing about what the other side's intentions might be. They're all having to speculate about what intentions are. So, for example, Putin probably thinks that there is no risk to his troops in Syria from the United States. But he doesn't know that. He hasn't had the categorical assurances from the US president that might make him confident in this. So he is going to have that element of doubt and uncertainty in his mind. And he's going to take precautions. And he said, well, I've got now my fighter jets flying over the Black Sea, and they've got hypersonic missiles, and this isn't a threat, it's just a warning. I'm warning you that if these missiles have the range to reach the Eastern Mediterranean, which is where your carriers happen to be. Now, that is actually a very bad situation for us all to be in, where Putin has to guess, and at the same time, because he can't be sure, he's having to take in his own mind those sort of precautions. That is exactly the kind of uncertainty which, in a crisis of the kind that we are going through at the moment, can potentially lead to disaster. Because, of course, where everybody is guessing, there is always the potential, there's always the very real risk that people will guess wrong, misunderstand what is happening, interpret things in the wrong way, and see things that might not actually be threatening in a particularly threatening way. So the first priority should be to start proper communications. Once you get communications going, then gradually over time you can rebuild trust, and perhaps you can have a proper, workable, viable relationship. Given how bad relations between the Russians and the West have now become, that is probably going to take a very long time. But what do they say? A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. Talking to the Russians in a civil way about mutual problems, and by the way, Elon is right, there is no greater priority than preserving peace. You're not sacrificing your core interests by preserving peace. Preserving peace between the great powers, the superpowers, is a core interest. And all of the great powers, all the superpowers, they're all led by people who should understand this, will understand, if it's approached in a certain way, that achieving a sustainable peace is one in which all of the great powers respect the core interests of the other. So you can find your way, you can gradually build up a relationship in that way. But at the moment, given the very dangerous situation we are in, we must unblock these utterly, completely blocked communications channels. We must talk to the Russians. They must be able to talk to us, just as JFK did at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was in direct contact through the embassy with Khrushchev. They were sending letters to each other. They were communicating in that kind of way. We've got to be able to do that. We've got to be able to talk to the Chinese leaders, even if we see them as adversaries. We've got to be able to talk to the Iranians, and they've got to be able to talk with us. And doing it through, at lower levels, through meetings between spies and lower level diplomats, is never enough in a situation like this, where leaders have to be able to communicate directly to each other in order to get an understanding of each other and to understand, to develop trust.
Well, I would say Biden just did the opposite of that by putting Putin in the Hamas category in his latest speech. I mean, that's not the way to reestablish a communication channel.
Well, I think it was an absolutely brought together Putin with Hamas. I mean, they are completely different things. Let's be absolutely clear. Russia and Hamas have nothing in common with each other. I thought that was completely misconceived, and it has made further discussion at this time, not just between the Russians and the Americans, but the whole attitude behind the speech, even more difficult than it should be. As Vivek absolutely correctly said, way back during the Cold War, we had communications with each other. During the Vietnam War, Kissinger went to China. He brokered a meeting between Nixon and Mao Zedong. We had communications regularly with the Soviets, and the result was that peace between the great powers was preserved. We are not in that position at this time.
Yeah, and I just want to build on something Elon said, which is I think American policy must start with a realistic assessment of our power and the distribution of power. And I think this administration seems to be living in a past era when the U.S. dominated the world and could do whatever it wanted. I think we saw this with the Ukraine war. Biden and the administration said that sanctions would collapse the Russian economy. It has not done that. I think the Russian economy had a negative 2% blip last year. Now it's back to growth. They claimed that the Russians were running out of missiles and other kinds of weapons. That has not happened. In fact, it's the U.S. that has run out of 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, which is the key type of ammunition in this war. That to me was absolutely stunning, that the U.S. could run out of artillery shells. I mean, we spend over $800 billion a year on defense, and apparently ammunition is not included. The administration claimed that this counteroffensive was going to be stunningly successful, and it's basically gone nowhere. In fact, the latest map published by the New York Times showed that, if anything, it's the Russians who've gained a small amount of territory on a net basis during this counteroffensive. So the administration has constantly now, for the last couple of years, put forward these assertions of what it was going to do and what its policies were going to lead to. And in every case, it's been hubristic. None of those predictions have come true. And now we find ourselves in perhaps the biggest crisis of all, and our stockpiles are depleted, and the administration does not seem to be using diplomacy in the way that Alexander just said. And so I think this is fundamentally the reason why even publications like Axios, which are well-connected Beltway publications, are sounding alarm bells about where things stand. So it's, again, they're quoting unnamed Washington officials. So this, to me, is the most dangerous part of it. Is in theory, it should be easy to avoid World War III because no one wants it. But we have an administration in Washington that seems to be blundering around, that is constantly overplaying its hand,
Yeah.
and doesn't seem to be using diplomacy whatsoever.
I think we are sleepwalking our way into World War III. Sleepwalking our way into World War III, with one foolish decision after another, as you outlined, David, and and really people should be deeply self-reflective. If their predictions have not come true, they should consider whether perhaps their other predictions might not come true either. I mean, what is the track record here? It's not good.
It's funny in the investing world, in the VC world in which, we operate. Track record is all important. When you want to assess whether an investor is good at their job or not, the first thing you look at is track record. But
Exactly.
in international relations, there seems to be no concept of a track record.
Yes, it's astonishing, and the stakes are so much higher. I mean, we're talking about many, many lives and devastation, and I just want to keep reiterating this point. Civilizational risk must be paramount, because if civilization goes away, it's all over for everyone. Just it worries me that the veterans of World War II are almost all dead. So those who remember the horrors of a world war are no longer, who has the visceral knowledge of what a world war is really like. When people have grown up coddled in comfort, they have no concept of war. I remember talking to my grandfather, who was in World War II for, I think, almost 6 years, in brutal conflict in North and East Africa. All his friends were killed in front of him. He had severe PTSD, like severe. I didn't even know what it was as a kid, but so severe. And in fact, if he he didn't finish high school, so he wasn't eligible for the officer corps. And I think it was a year or two before the end of the war, they randomly gave some aptitude test or IQ test or whatever to people, and he scored high. So they sent him to work for British intelligence in London, which is where he met my grandmother, who's English. And if that hadn't happened, he'd be dead, and I probably wouldn't exist. But I mean, you could see the effects of war in his face and personality. I mean, it was just he was destroyed, even though he was still alive. And how many people like that actually are still around, who remember the horrors of a global war, or remember war at all?
Well, this is where I think we need some fresh leadership in Washington, because people who've been there for 30 years plus simply, I think, don't seem to remember or don't really understand the way in which the world has changed. We're not in the unipolar moment anymore.
Correct.
And the people who developed all of their political instincts during that moment, I think, have failed to grasp the ways in which the world has changed. And this is why we need some fresh thinking and fresh leadership in Washington. I'm sure Vivek will agree with that.
Yeah, I'm biased, but I agree with you. And, one of the things is interesting in the polling data is amongst young people. I mean, and the idea of entering war, including the Ukraine war, but beyond this, is incredibly unpopular, right? I mean, those of us even who grew up in the Iraq and Afghanistan era alone, these things are very unpopular amongst young people. And the other thing that I'm seeing is, this is just a little bit of inside baseball here, but the general political conventional wisdom right now is most of the Republican base still is in favor of the good versus evil framing. But I will tell you, on the ground, that is not what I see when it's presented in a different form than the poll questions are served up. I mean, I've spent the last 5 days in Iowa, and, mostly everything I'm saying I've been advised is politically unadvisable to say to a Republican base. But to tell you the truth, once you explain to people, look, this is not that we're anti-Ukraine or anti-Israel, but this is a pro-American, or as Elon even put it, pro-civilizational view to keep us out of World War III. I see more heads nodding than not. And so I do think it's going to take people, not just in the presidency. I mean, I think the presidency is important. I think it's important that you have somebody that comes from a different generation, unbiased and unencumbered by the biases of the past in a liberal hegemonic era that does not exist anymore. It's not 1991. It's not 1980. We have to accept realism in where we are as the United States, or else we may make boneheaded decisions, sleepwalking our way into war that may cause the United States of America, as we know it, to be at risk of ceasing to exist. But I also think that it's going to require people in positions in the administration that, you can't come in as a post-neocon Republican and then put a bunch of neocons in the staffing of your administration, from national security advisor to secretary of state on down. And I think it's going to take rational, reasoned thinkers who are able to understand how the interests of different nations align or don't align with one another, and reach reasonable deals, consensus, to bring peace in a situation that I think there's opportunities for it, both in the Russia-Ukraine situation and under more complex circumstances, even in the conflict in the Middle East with Israel, that I think would best serve the interests of everyone involved, but certainly the United States. And I do think that we may be at our best in a moment where the U.S. is expressly thinking about its own interests and acknowledges that other nations are allowed to do the same, and then reasonably achieve paths to peace, rather than trying to implement the model of liberal hegemony that I think many in both parties wish we were in from 30 years ago. So
Yeah,
that's what I think.
If I may play somewhat of a sort of slight devil's advocate for liberalism, actually, which may be unexpected, and also start off with a quote of, or paraphrase Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings: "There is some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." I think that is the good part of liberalism. That is that you actually have empathy for other people and other countries, and that there are times when we'll do things that perhaps don't entirely serve ourselves, but sometimes even sacrifice a little bit of the good of our country for the better of another. But we just need to make sure that is actually what is going to happen, and that in seeking to do good, we do not pave the road to hell. So that we are realistic in seeking to do good. I think we should seek to do good. I think that is one of the great characteristics of America, is that we actually do not simply act on the basis of might is right. And if you look at the history of the United States, well, after World War II, we had nukes and nobody else did. We could have taken over the world. We could have absolutely subjugated anyone. And yet, did we do that? No. In fact, we helped rebuild Japan. We helped rebuild Europe. And I think that served the greater good. But it's important to us that is really quite unusual by historical standards. And I'm not saying that the United States only does good things. The United States has done good and bad things. But on balance, I think the United States has been a great force for benevolence, probably more so than any country in history. And that is worthy of admiration. And so I do think that is a good thing. But we don't want to be naive in seeking to do good. We want to care about the reality of doing good, not the perception of it. So
I think that's what.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, I think that was beautifully said. I think we live in a moment right now where those things go together, where we bring a realism to our foreign policy. I think a realism would actually result in the outcome that was best for Ukraine, for Israel, but by looking at it through an actual realist perspective, that I think we live, at least right now, in a moment where that's actually going to lead to the greater good by advancing, a national self-interest. In this moment we're in, I think that's actually the frame that will achieve the greater good result that you talk about too. So I think we're synchronous, but maybe coming at it from different angles there.
Sounds good. Yeah, I just think, like, sometimes, Vivek, I think I agree with you actually, but I just want to make sure that people sort of generally understand that we're not talking about sort of just engaging in purely selfish behavior that only ever serves purely the interests of the United States, but that we actually do care about other countries and other people, and we want to make sure that that actions we take are actually successful in helping those people, and do not actually, as we seek perhaps to help them, in fact hurt them. So there's I'm a big fan of South Park and the Trey Parker and Matt Stone, and there's a movie Team America where we're Team America World Police. The movie starts off with with a sort of terrorist attack in Paris, and then Team America comes in to just destroy the terrorists, but also levels half of Paris. It's like, well, I don't know if that was, should we have leveled half of Paris to destroy some terrorists? Perhaps not. So we just need to make sure that when we seek to do good, that we in fact do achieve it, and that we're realistic and do not inadvertently pave the road to hell with our good intentions.
Amen. I'm good for another at least 10 minutes, X, but I think that's actually
that could be a great moment to end on. Yeah,
I think well said, Elon, and I think that I am an advocate for, and let me just say this, if you talk about the presidency, that's in self-interest or whatever to talk about new people and outsiders and whatever, but go a layer deeper. The more I've learned about this, I think the more I'm convinced that you not only need that at the level of whoever's on top of the executive branch, but in the State Department, in other parts of the federal bureaucracy that hopefully only a small subset of which survive, still need probably in the next chapter some people who have a muscle memory different than the one they've been trained on, which is to think they're doing good or convince themselves of the ultimate lie that they're doing good when in fact they're creating more harm than good, even not just for the United States, but for those other very actors they purport to help. And so, we'll see if we can't get there and, clean that up and staff it accordingly. So thank you guys. Appreciate this discussion. Learned a lot actually today too from the others who participated. So thanks to everybody else you called on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Policy Tensor. Thanks, Colonel Davis. Thanks to everyone who participated. We will see you next time.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, guys.